Well, it looks like Nintendo Switch 2 could be set to do the unthinkable. Unthinkable, that is, if you are somebody who believes it will be very hard for Nintendo to hit the levels of success that they did with the massively popular original Nintendo Switch from a sales perspective, as we have some analysts chiming in on this exact topic right now that's making the rounds online, and I want to give my 2 cents on it. Because the claim in this particular story we're talking about is not only will Nintendo supposedly this time around outsell the original Switch launch in its first quarter, but also go on to do things like outsell the PS5 launch at 4.5 million units in its first quarter. And we do have some specific comments from Furukawa in terms of how they plan to support the market, but now also revisiting within this article outlines some of the data that we have to back up those claims. And I still think that this thing's going to sell like hotcakes, and as many units as Nintendo can produce is likely going to be close to what they sell, provided that they, of course, market the console correctly and we see a nice launch lineup of games and games to come in future months. But if done correctly, when it comes to console launches, Nintendo could be looking at the biggest one of all time in the books. So we're going to get on the same page with all of this info. Before we do, make sure you like, subscribe, and turn on your bell notification to join Sunbro Nation if you're new here. And I want to first kick it off by hopping over to Nintendo Life, where they do have the article with exactly what this particular sales analyst is saying when it comes to the overall success and the amount of units that he is expecting Nintendo Switch 2 to sell in the first quarter. Analysts expect Switch 2 to sell like hotcakes in its first quarter, preempting a battle with the PS6. As it enters its 9th year, it's fairly safe to say that Nintendo Switch has been quite the sales hit, like 150 million units, third best-selling console of all time, kind of a hit. We've previously heard analysts make the low-hanging fruit prediction that Switch 2 sales numbers might not live up to that of its predecessor, but that doesn't mean that it won't come out of the gates at a full-on sprint. At least that's according to what Toyo Securities analyst Hideki Yasuda is expecting. In a recent blog post on the Japanese GamesIndustry.biz website, Yasuda states that he expects the Switch 2 to shift an impressive 6 million units in its first quarter, the second quarter of fiscal year 2025/26, assuming the console lands a July release. This, according to Yasuda, would be an incredible number and could completely shatter the widespread industry superstition that game consoles must be released during the year-end holiday sales season. The analyst points to Nintendo's production history and inventory stock to explain his calculation. According to Yasuda, Nintendo upped its inventory in Q3 of this financial year, months where stock generally sees a decrease after the holiday sales period, suggesting that the company is hard at work preparing what comes next. It's worth bearing in mind that the production of the PS5 was assumed to have begun 5 months before its release, and that went on to sell 4.5 million units in its first quarter. If Yasuda's estimates are to be believed, the period between production and release for Switch 2 will have been much longer, potentially putting Q1 sales above that 6 million prediction. With the stock increase landing halfway through the fiscal year before Switch 2 launch, Yasuda believes that Nintendo is planning to flood the market with Switch 2, creating a situation where PlayStation cannot catch up and settle the battle for this generation against PS6. Heck, shifting 6 million Switch 2s would sure give Sony some catching up to do down the line. Just for reference, Switch 1 sold 2.74 million units to cap off its first quarter in March of 2017. It released on March 3rd, let's not forget, and further a 1.97 million the following quarter. But the hybrid was scarce at launch, not PS5 scarce, but far from readily available as you might like. We'd wager Nintendo doesn't want to repeat the same situation with its follow-up. And so what's a little bit funny to me about this analyst's mindset is that he feels like Nintendo would be going out and proving for the first time that you can launch a console outside of a holiday sales window and have it hit massive numbers like this. But if you just look at the own numbers that we were talking about in that same article for the Nintendo Switch 1 launch, it hit about 4.71 million between March being the launch month and the following fiscal quarter. So yeah, 6 million is actually a huge increase, 4.71 over the launch month and a full quarter. Obviously that's giving it more time to hit that number, and 4.5 million for the PS5 is absolutely huge. So yeah, no doubt 6 million would be absolutely a massive number for Nintendo. But if production has been steadily flowing behind the scenes this entire time, and we are to believe Furukawa's previous comments that the way they plan to combat scalping is just to truly come as close as possible to meeting market demand, meaning we can find these things on store shelves and online via pre-orders, and it's not going to solve scalping entirely, don't get me wrong, but it very well could be that Nintendo is purposely creating a longer production cycle for this next generation hardware to try to combat scalping and actually come out of the gate incredibly strong with some of the largest sales numbers we've ever seen in terms of a console launch, especially being that outside of a holiday season. And what this really boils down to, in my opinion, at the end of the day, is what kind of games are must-own day one titles that launch around the console's launch window, not necessarily exactly at launch day, but rather the first 3 months of this console being out. Do we have potentially 3 to 5, maybe even upwards of 7 must-play first-party Nintendo pieces of software in gamers' minds? And, you know, some of these are going to be the big Mario Karts for the first time since Deluxe came out on the Switch. And then originally that, of course, was a Wii U port. So, like, the first fresh Mario Kart experience in literally over 10 years is going to hit, presumably right in the launch window of this console. The next 3D Mario game, I'm still thinking that's going to be like a holiday season game. But nonetheless, we know that's in the pipeline. And even if you are marketing a game that's maybe not there yet, but you know it's going to be coming soon, that's another reason that people would rush out to buy this thing sooner rather than later. We are also talking about Nintendo coming off of an install base of 150 million users, many of which have had their Switch for years and years at this point, because we're talking about an over 8-year-old console at the time of filming. And when we get into the launch of this next console, it'll be 8.25 years old. Now, the analyst did point out and assume some kind of July launch in this article. I'm still expecting a June launch, maybe even as soon as late May. That is definitely what we were hearing from sources like Nate the Hate, or at least that seemed to be the general idea around the time of when Nintendo will launch it. And if you look at history in terms of how Nintendo launched the Switch 1 following its January blowout presentation, it was 50 days after that presentation, which would actually land right on May 22nd, which funnily enough is a Thursday. But this isn't a launch day speculation video, but you get the idea. We'll probably see Nintendo stick to that rough script of timeline for when they deep dove the Switch 1 to when it launched. We'll probably see them follow similar footprints to that on the Switch 2's launch, which leads me to believe late May, early June is actually when this console will indeed launch. And then the question becomes, how hard is it to actually secure one? And that's where you might want to, remember to get subscribed to this channel, because while I will still be covering all of my regular news and topic videos that relate to Nintendo Switch 2 and all of the games coming out for it, I will also be making a few different separate dedicated pre-order guides in terms of how to secure a day one console. If you miss the day one rush, how do you get the next wave of restocks, and basically how to be best prepared for when the retail drops do happen, because you have to do a few things online with these retailers ahead of time, and you have to have certain stock tracker accounts set up and things if you really want to make sure you get this thing from an online order. If you can find one local, that's just kind of a gamble, and there's some GameStop type setups where sometimes they do in-store pre-orders for in-store customers. You can get away with one-off situations like that, but for the most part, if you're going to try to order this thing online, there is some strategy and technique to it. And believe it or not, I was covering that stuff around the PS5 launch back on this channel, so I have some experience with it, and I'll definitely be putting my 2 cents in on that kind of stuff. But I do tend to believe that a number like 6 million, while it is aggressive and potentially record-shattering in terms of a console launch, I do think that it's something that Nintendo could potentially hit with the Switch 2, with the success and momentum they have behind the current family of systems and the install base that is really plugged into Nintendo this time around. Because while you could argue that the Wii was a huge success and then the Wii U was a failure, Nintendo did not have the social media following and presence that they have now, where they can put a video out there and get millions of views just like that overnight, because between their YouTube socials, their Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, like all the social media platforms, they have a presence on at this point, and they have dedicated fans that follow them and follow content creators that talk about them. People are very connected and in the loop with what's happening at Nintendo now, compared to when they made some marketing missteps in the past. Things just did flop for the Wii U, quite literally. So I found this prediction to be an interesting one. I don't think it's probably that far off base, especially if we are to believe that Nintendo has been producing these things for longer than usual. And I think that they have, and I think that's why a lot of the console leaked out ahead of time before we ever got that first look trailer, because Nintendo was producing it for longer. But that's where I really want to hear from you guys at this point in the video. What do you make of this one analyst prediction around this sales number? Do you think 6 million is something that is reasonable and that Nintendo could achieve? Do you think it will be lower than that of the Switch 1 Q1 launch? Do you think it all comes down to software and marketing, kind of like what I am thinking? Like, Nintendo will have to have some banger titles there day one to really sell that amount of units. And do you think Nintendo will kind of solve the scalping issue with this for the most part? Or do you think it's going to be just like PS5 and Switch 1 all over again, where you can't find the thing easily for months, or in some case, a year, 2 years plus down the road after launch? But make sure you share all your thoughts and feelings in the comments down below before you leave, regardless if we agree or disagree. Also, make sure you like, subscribe, turn your notification bell. And with that, I've been Sunbro, you've been Nation. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.